All right, so today I'm going to be explaining, I think, a rather unknown part of Asian American history, and that is the Coolie trade. So I'm going to be talking to my friend William here about it. So that's going to be exciting. Say hi to everybody, William.
Hi to the camera.
And William is my friend. So I thought I'd started off by saying there already existed a sort of empire in Asia. Well, this whole thing is really about empire and its effect on Asia. So there is this Manila galleon trade that had been happening between, I think it's Acapulco and what is it? Acapulco and Manila. And it didn't just transport goods, it also transported people too. So this is kind of a preface for coolie migration. And you may be asking, what's a coolie? And a coolie could be South Asian indentured laborers in the British West Indies. It could also be a Chinese indentured laborers in Peru and Cuba.
Isn't that a slur?
Uh, I wouldn't use it, but yeah, it was kind of a term at the time to refer to all those kind of people. So honestly, I would say partially. But yeah, so that was kind of before the early 1800s, and then now going on to the 1800s, we have empire really beginning to exist in Asia, starting with the Opium Wars. I don't know if you've heard much about the Opium Wars in Asia, specifically China. I'm talking about. We're looking at the first Opium War, which was kind of like the British. How do I say this? The British kind of entered Asia with this drug, and were like, they entered Asia, or specifically China, with opium, and introduced it and wanted it to be a like big business in China. But the current like leader of China was like, we don't like that. And so sort of they forced this drug onto the Chinese people. And then when the Chinese leader was like, no, we don't like that, and destroyed a few chests of opium, I think it was, then a war started over it. So basically, I feel like the British started that war, and then they were like, oh no, you don't like what we forced upon you, we're gonna like destroy you now. And then out of that, since they won, they got to decide the Treaty of Nanking in 1842 after the first Opium War, which was between 1839 and 1842. So they got to decide those terms, I'd say, and they just expanded their opium kind of business there, and started to enact more we have control over your government policies, such as like abolishing the Kohong system, which was like an already existing trade system throughout Guangzhou province, I think it was. And as a result, this like destroys cottage industry kind of productions. Taxes skyrocket, and obviously opium addiction is pretty intense. So with all these new demands, no good things came out of it. And there was also a second opium war after that, in which there is the Treaty of Tianjin.
And wait, what exactly did the Treaty of Nanking do?
So the Treaty of Nanking, see, I have it right here. It opened 5 new ports for the British. It abolished the Kohong system, which was a existing trade system in China at the time. And it also did no diplomatic protocol, and it also forced themselves as the most favored nation status for trade in China. And it also legalized opium, opened a bunch of ports for them, basically further establishing their presence as like controllers in Asia, in China at that point.
Oh, okay, so big win for the British.
Yeah, a big win for the British. And then after the Second Opium War, the Treaty of Tianjin happened, and they opened 10 more ports. And basically allowed this coolie trade to start happening. So basically it was people being taken from China and other places in Asia. Right now I'm specifically focusing on China. Allowed them to be taken from their homes forcibly and sent to places in the West to be used as indentured servants or laborers. So it was kind of a whole process of like people being uprooted from their home, like British entering, British forcing opium upon them to gain ahead in trade, and then being like, oh, why do you guys not like this? And the fact that they didn't like it just furthered their justification for subjugating these peoples and transporting them across in a sort of middle passage that, like a different middle passage that people don't usually talk about. So I would say that
So like slaves? Like slave trade?
basically slave trade. Coolie labor is in a way sort of overlooked. But they were traded just as often as like middle passage labor, I'd say. So it's just a part that people don't really look at a lot. And as a result, it resulted in like a massive dislocation of Asian people, specifically in China. And give me 1 second here. Let me look at some other stuff. And as a result, led to a sort of coercion in the coolie trade too. Most of it was actually by coercion, and a sort of like, oh, you'll get this if you come with us. Oh, sign this and you'll be okay. Stuff like that. And in order to get them on a ship and across to the U.S., basically.
Wait, so did opium have anything to do with the coolie trade?
I would say due to the Treaty of Tianjin allowing the coolie trade, or creating these sort of coercion contracts and credit ticket systems, which like kind of allowed Asian peoples to be like taken, or Chinese, more like the Chinese at the time. I'd say the Opium War was directly allowed that to happen, if you know what I mean. Like it beforehand, they didn't really have their tentacles in China, but opium allowed them to exist in China as more than just like more than just like a trade partner, more of like, we control your trade now. We're going to abolish your trade system, and you will trade opium, and you will legalize it, and we'll make money off of it, and then that will allow us to sort of enter China as a bigger power, to be able to send coolie labor to the U.S. and our new acquired territories, especially the 1800s, like 1830s through 70s.
Oh.
So I'd say Opium War did have a pretty direct impact on allowing that to happen, especially in the what the terms of the treaties ended up being. Basically, the massive dislocation was also due to, like I said, due to economic and political circumstances from the European Empire at the time, and the rapid industrialization of just societies around the world, causing labor shortages, the need for cheap labor, and that sort of was like, okay, well, China is the perfect place to find this and ship them off now that we're economically in control of China and all its trade, and the Kohong system is abolished at this point. And what the Kohong system did was sort of like set all the prices, collected tariffs, and stuff like that, and made the Chinese emperors a lot of money, but this meant that the British were losing money on their trade. Let me think about that for a second. Give me a second here. Yeah, so basically it favored the leaders in provinces that had this Kohong system and gained the emperor's support. But at that time, when opium was being introduced, was when one of the leaders, I don't even know how to pronounce that. Lin Si Su. I'm going to say that completely wrong. But he destroys like thousands of chests of opium, and that's what slingshots them into the First War, because it was basically a trade. Like their trade was being threatened, their existing Kohong system was being threatened, and like really, the British had no right to be there in the first place. So, just kind of like forcing it upon these people, I guess you could say, is a perfect way of describing it. And I also want to talk about one last thing before we discuss a little bit further. Frederick Douglass in 1869 in his speech, The Composite Nation, talks about, and they mention it as being extremely radical for the time. Not until like 100 years later did they even think about these ideas, was right after the Civil War, how Asian Americans really deserved equal footing with African Americans at the time, especially in terms of voting rights, talking about 14th, 13th Amendment, stuff like that.
Were the Asian citizens behind on rights compared with the African American citizens?
Yes, I'd say especially going at this point in time, 1869, going into the 1870s is when you start seeing Asian Americans looked at as really competitors in the market. Post-Civil War era economics, Asian Americans were, especially like coolie laborers, were seen as competitors, right? I'm sure you've heard of like the market revolution with Germans and the Irish in the 1860s. They were sort of seen like competitors in a way. Like it was really radical to think of them on equal footing and equal voting rights, just due to the fact that from the time they entered America, they were already seen as laborers, less than people, you know. And it's really weird because this also ties into the fact that race, talking about race and how we see race in terms of racial hierarchy and superiority, like there's prime examples of like, I think Filipinos in Louisiana is what we talked about in this class, being seen as like white and on equal footing with like white people. And it really goes to show that like race is whatever the people in power decide it is, and they can like subjugate whoever they want. So Chinese coolie laborers could have been seen as like equal footing with whites and racially superior people. But in terms of this, their entrance into the US was through forced migration, forced labor, already seen as cheap, disposable labor. So I think from that point, it was really hard to exist as something other than that until like 100 years later, you know, when people started thinking, okay, maybe past the time of the Chinese Exclusion Act and all of that stuff, like mid to late 19th, 20th century. So to answer your question, I think I don't even I kind of wrapped around there a little bit, but I think they were just seen on equal footing as like even less so, because the Civil War was mostly about the rights of slavery and African American labor and the South. So I think post that was really the era of railroad and railroad working, which was the majority of coolie labor at that time. So I think it was more, they weren't seen as human yet, and I think they were like a lot later on than African Americans. in terms of that, just because this whole process of empire being imposed in China, them being taken from empire, them being forced into the U.S., and then them being subjugated just based off of that.
Okay.
I think it's a really like all-encompassing process. So I don't know if you had anything else to say. I kind of just like word souped all of that. Like I think it just has to do with empire and the British effect in China to begin with, because it allowed them to do everything. That's all you had to say. Well, what do you feel like you learned after all that?
I learned about some lesser known aspects of Asian culture.
Yeah. Well, yeah, because I think people don't really talk about how coolies, but Chinese laborers got into the U.S. Because I'm sure you've heard about them in railroads, but you don't really think about like what happened to them before then, or all that stuff. But yeah, anyway. Thank you for listening to my explanation, and I hope you learned a lot, because I'm learning a lot from this class.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
I mean,
William.
Thank you.
All right, guys.